I would also add there's this question of whether we'll see governments around the world starting to add Bitcoin to their own balance sheets. I would say that that possibility is not priced into the market at all. If that becomes a reality, I think you're talking about Bitcoin being many hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's just not enough Bitcoin in the world to support to facilitate that kind of demand without prices going substantially higher. So I think this is a real sea change. I think investors have underestimated it. I think it's going to have a long tail effect. It'll extend the bull market substantially in 2025 and potentially beyond. I'm hugely excited about it.
Hey guys, welcome back to the show today. I'm here with one of my favorite guests, CIO at Bitwise. Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing so well. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
The Bitcoin ETF broke basically every single record. Has gone from 0 to 40 billions in less than 1 year. I think it was 211 days. And the previous record was 1,253 days, which is 3.5 years. So why do you think this happened?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the important thing to note, you said broke every record. It shattered them. As you mentioned, it's not even close. It's orders of magnitude bigger. You take the best performing financial asset of all time, which is Bitcoin, and you take a 10-year delay for demand to build up and a huge audience of people who don't feel comfortable buying Bitcoin any other way, and you put them together, and it's just a spectacular result. Of course, there were other elements, right? There was what was going on with MicroStrategy pushing prices higher. There was what was going on with the US election pushing prices higher. But there was just huge pent-up demand. The thing I always come back to is the vast majority of investors still have zero exposure to Bitcoin. That has to change, right? Most investors are going to end up owning Bitcoin. The ETF was the first release valve to see that happen, and that led to this spectacular result.
You said that about 80% of the volume in ETF was coming from retail. Do you see the same behavior coming in?
It's starting to change. It's starting to change in the direction of more balanced. If you look at most ETFs globally, they vary by ETF, but it's fairly typical to have about half from retail and half from institutional. And that's the direction of travel we're seeing on these Bitcoin ETFs. You're seeing the share of institutional demand tick up a little bit. We're still in the high 70s on retail, but I think that will really start to change when we get the Q4 numbers. You get those reporting about 6 weeks in arrears. So we'll get the Q4 numbers in mid-February. I think you'll start to see it more like 75-25. And then over the course of the year, that's going to balance out more towards 50-50. The important thing there is that what that tells you is we've set these records and the real institutional demand has only just started to trickle in. So it tells you that this inflow has a long way to go. I expect the $40 billion we see to be eclipsed significantly in 2025. I expect more inflows in 2025 than 2024. And it's because those institutions are really going to start to buy in mass.
I'm super bullish on ETH still. Ethereum usually performs really well in Q1. So there is an ETF there as well, which I think we start seeing inflows. If you remember, guys, Matt told us in the beginning, there's going to be a slow pickup even on Bitcoin. The volume into the buying on the ETF was kind of steady, and then suddenly, boom, and it goes.
That's exactly right. These demand curves are exponential, which means even in the early phases when they're building, you barely notice because it's going from a few million to like maybe 5 or 6 million. You start to see it, and then it escalates like that. And that's what we're going to see on Ethereum. There are a couple reasons for that. One is that, as you know, whenever an investor comes into crypto through Bitcoin, it sort of marinates for a while, and then they start to learn more about crypto. And then 6 to 12 months later, they buy Ethereum and other altcoins. That's happened for 15 years in crypto. And of course, it's going to happen with ETFs. So you get this echo boom. But I'm also just organically excited about where Ethereum is and where it's going in 2025. I think the setup is extremely strong to benefit from agentic AI, to benefit from stablecoin demand, to benefit from tokenization. All of those play directly into Ethereum, more so than any other programmable blockchain. So I think there's both this sort of natural increase in demand for the ETF, and then these huge catalysts from what I expect to happen in 2025. So I'm really bullish on ETH inflows in 2025.
Are you expecting an index, for example, an ETF which has a bunch of different cryptos coming in?
Long term, that's where most of the demand is going to be. If you look in the traditional sort of equity space, people don't buy one stock. they tend to buy an index fund. That's going to be true in crypto as well. There have been a couple products. Bitwise has an application, which I can't speak to specifically, but there have been a couple filings to launch these index-based ETFs. You got to remember, most traditional investors don't live in this world like I do. They think about crypto, a few minutes a week. They just want exposure. And for these people, an index-based products that'll be mostly Bitcoin, some Ethereum, and then some exposure to Solana and other altcoins will be the perfect product for them. And I think they'll attract tens of billions of dollars of inflows over time. One of the biggest trends last year was corporations buying Bitcoin. MicroStrategy gets all the press, but there are dozens of companies beyond MicroStrategy that are moving on to this sort of Bitcoin standard of keeping their corporate treasury in Bitcoin, both public companies and then, of course, private companies as well, like Bitwise. But we, think there is demand to invest in these companies that recognize that holding traditional cash on a balance sheet is a losing proposition, right? Fiat currency loses value over time. So why do America's public companies and the world's public companies hold trillions of dollars in an asset that is depreciating over time? The smarter companies are moving on to this Bitcoin standard. So without talking about, again, the specific filing, which we made, and you can see at the SEC site, we think there is substantial demand to invest in these Bitcoin standard style companies. And we think it's a real differentiating factor, right? I think these are companies that get it. They see what's happened with the money printing. They see what's happening with fiat currencies worldwide. They're opting out of it onto a Bitcoin-based treasury strategy. And we think, though, those kind of companies will be rewarded in the future.
I completely agree. I think we've seen a bunch, like Rumble came out not long ago saying 20 million, which is great. MetaPlanet is killing it. Of course, there is a bunch. But also we've seen Microsoft saying no. I think only 0.5% was in favor. Why do you think they are still not even considering having a strategic reserve in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize who aren't in the traditional equity world that voting in traditional stocks is not like voting in crypto. Voting in crypto has real community engagement. People are engaged. They think about it. Most voting in the traditional equity world uses these proxy voting providers who are institutional consultants, the most TradFi of TradFi institutions as well. So when you see a vote like that, you shouldn't interpret it as actual Microsoft's shareholders only 0.5%. It's really that the institutional capital outsources voting and these TradFi suits just reflexively vote with the company. I think eventually you're going to see a Mag 7 company own substantial amounts of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. These are tech adjacent firms. Maybe it's not Microsoft, maybe it's Meta, maybe it's another firm, but I think you're going to start to see this happen. This has gone from a sort of crazy idea that only Michael Saylor was doing to an idea that now dozens of companies are doing. I think it will be hundreds of companies, and I think they'll be buying hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin per year. It's sort of another source of insatiable demand for Bitcoin.
We are about 2 weeks away from Trump being in office, right? So this has to impact. Some people are saying, oh, the Trump effect is already priced in, which I completely disagree. So there's going to be a pro-crypto administration. We've seen Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, resigning today, and apparently the best candidate is a pro-crypto. So I think we're going to see a FOMO, a country FOMO.
I think people have underestimated the degree of this change, right? I mean, crypto has been seen in a negative light by governments for the last decade. It's been fighting uphill, and it's not just gotten to neutral. It's gotten to overtly positive. You mentioned, of course, the Trump takeover has its own crypto czar. And in Canada, as you mentioned, the leading candidate is overtly pro-Bitcoin. Canada was like the anti-Bitcoin a few years ago. You remember the trucker protests and all of that. And now to see a potential prime minister who is pro-Bitcoin, I think people have dramatically underestimated the scale of this. I would also add, there's this question of whether we'll see governments around the world starting to add Bitcoin to their own balance sheets. I would say that possibility is not priced into the market at all, like zero. If that becomes a reality, I think you're talking about Bitcoin being many hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's just not enough Bitcoin in the world to support to facilitate that kind of demand without prices going substantially higher. So I think this is a real sea change. I think investors have underestimated it. I think it's going to have a long tail effect. It'll extend the bull market substantially in 2025 and potentially beyond. I'm hugely excited about it.
There is not going to be enough coins on the market. So are you expecting a supply shock at some point coming in?
Look, I mean, that's just the way math works, right? Like the Bitcoin network is going to produce about 160, 170,000 Bitcoin next year. Corporations bought 270,000 last year. ETFs bought 500,000. Governments are talking about buying hundreds of thousands. Any one of these sources is more than all the net new Bitcoin that comes out of the market. And that means, just from a simple perspective, that in order to satisfy that demand, which I think is unstoppable, I think you're going to see all three sources buy hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. People who hold Bitcoin today have to sell. Maybe they're willing to sell at $100,000, but if they're not, what is the next level at which enough of them will sell? Is it 125? Is it 150? Is it $200,000? I think the market could sort of find itself in an air gap where people are unwilling to sell until it gets to a new major level. And that move could be very violent. You might remember last year, we bumped around the all-time high at like $72,000 for 6 or 7 months. And then when we broke through it, straight to 100, right? I think you could have an element like that here as well. We're hovering around $100,000, but if we get above it, straight to something, I don't know what that something is, but there is just too much demand, not enough supply, and the only solution to that is higher prices. I think that's what we're going to see in 2025.
And it makes sense. 100,000 at psychological level. There's a lot of people they bought at 1,000, maybe even 10,000. They've done their 10x and they want to sell. There's also always a number of short-term investors in Bitcoin because they don't understand, if you ask me, because I think Bitcoin is a long-term investment, but that's my opinion. So I think 100,000 is okay to see some selling pressure, but basically we built a base now and we are going up another leg. And I think the banana zone, as we call it, hasn't come in yet. So do you have a number in mind? What do you think companies and potentially nations at this point? I know it sounds crazy, but it is actually happening. They're going to FOMO into it.
Yeah, it does sound crazy, but it is actually happening. I love the way you said it. That defines where we are in the crypto market. Look, I think if we get 10 or 20% above $100,000, people are going to assume that there is a sort of black hole pulling Bitcoin up to $200,000. I think when you think about this market where there's a fundamental mismatch of net new demand versus net new supply, and that has to be filled by people willing to sell, I think you have to think about behavioral cliffs. Who's going to sell at $117,000? Right? No one is sitting at home on their sofa right now thinking, well, when it gets to $117,000, I'm going to sell. They're either thinking, I'm going to sell here at 100, or maybe I'm going to sell at 150, but probably I'm going to sell at 200 or 250. And I just think once we get sort of out of this center of gravity at $100,000, there is just this rush, as you said, people FOMOing in until it gets to, my guess is 200. It could be 250, maybe it's 150, but I suspect it's in that 200 zone. I've seen a lot of forecasts in and around $200,000. Bitwise said, we think Bitcoin will get above $200,000. I think 250 is definitely possible. That's a psychological number. And I think it could happen very fast.
Interesting will be the time frame, because if we stick to history, it should be towards the end of the year, right? So it should be maybe October, November, which are technically some of the most bullish moments of the year. But are you expecting still those 4-year cycles? Or now that we have a crypto pro administrations, countries, we have El Salvador buying, we have all these companies using strategic reserves, are we might see like the end of the cycles, the 4-year cycles, and maybe go into these so-called super cycle? How likely do you think it's going to be?
Oh, great question. I've been thinking about this one a lot. Look, the reason I think we have cycles is because in a bullish market, leverage builds up in the ecosystem, and then people do crazy things, and then that has to be washed out. I mean, you can make much more specific arguments for the 2022 bear market or 2018, but generally speaking, that's the vibe. Bull, leverage, insanity, washout. If we start ripping to 200K, we're going to have people that get over levered. We're going to have people who do wild things. We're going to have silly projects that are fraudulent. And that tells me that at some point we'll have a washout. Will it drop from 200 to 100? I don't think so. But if we went to 200, could we pull back 30%? Of course we could, right? Of course we could. We haven't repealed human nature. But I do think the winter, if it happens, will be much, much shallower. It will be like a global warming winter. It's going to happen over the course of a few months because you have these long-term bullish trends that are going to play out over years. Institutions are going to be moving into Bitcoin for the next 5 years. And so even if we have this blow off of leverage that leads to a significant pullback, it's going to be picked up by these long-term trends that I don't think are going anywhere. So we haven't repealed the 4-year cycle, but we've probably shallowed it and shortened it. And what that means for investors, I mean, from my perspective, is just ignore it. Just buy Bitcoin and hold it, and you'll be fine. It's impossible to time these things, but be aware that there's going to, yes, of course, at some point, leverage will build up and it'll get flushed out. It's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that we've repealed the bull market.
We share the same view here. I'm expecting if a pension funds invest in Bitcoin, they don't care if it doubles in 6 months. They probably have like a 10, 15, 20 years time frame. Of course, there's going to be people that will play the cycle, the month, but I think it's going to be a minority. If countries are going to adopt a strategic reserves, I don't think there is a strategy in having a country who sells when it doubles. It doesn't make sense, right?
No, I agree on that. I mean, there are two things that can really change the game and rewrite these cycles. The one is if you see this global game theory of countries looking to build positions in Bitcoin, it's Katie bar the door. We're in a completely different scenario where you could run for a substantial period of time. And then the other you mentioned is if you really see Bitcoin penetrate retirement savings being used in US 401ks as an example, which right now it effectively can't be. That's a game changer too, because people save for retirement every month. Bull market, bear market, it doesn't matter. Every month, automatically, even I save a portion of my paycheck that just buys stocks and bonds, right? Just without even thinking about it. And if you get that, you start to get much more support that sort of cushions any of these pullbacks because you have persistent price inelastic demand every single month. And so if we see that, I think that will be a game changer as well.
People have gone into real estate a lot because of they wanted to protect their capital. And now that we've seen people exploring new assets like Bitcoin, for example, are you expecting maybe real estate to cool off a little bit because less people are going to choose homes versus, for example, digital property like Bitcoin? Maybe with Bitcoin, we will see a level in there. I don't know if it makes sense.
That's an interesting question. I think that makes a fair amount of sense. Particularly, I would argue, I hadn't thought about it, but particularly in zones where you see a lot of offshore wealth, just owning real estate as a place to own their capital, right? You could buy a house in Mayfair or you could own Bitcoin. I think on the margin, you'll see people defecting to own Bitcoin in lieu of that house in Mayfair, which has carrying costs and all these other challenges that are associated with it. So yeah, I would say particularly in those offshore wealth haven spaces, you may be right. I mean, there's still limited demand, limited space, limited availability. But on the margin, you would imagine that people with wealth looking to preserve it from fiat debasement, more of them will go into Bitcoin than have in the past. We've already seen that with gold. I think gold would be, another $1,000 an ounce higher if we didn't have Bitcoin, because I think some of that demand is going into Bitcoin as well.
This is where probably some of the people were complaining about the fact that Ethereum had an ETF and saying, oh, people now are not going to buy Bitcoin ETF, they're going to buy Ethereum. I like the free market. So if there is a product and people want to buy it, who am I to stop it? Like, let it be.
I agree with that. I find that a lot of people out there at their core are Bitcoin monetary maximalists. They think of Bitcoin as money, but they're comfortable in that. They don't feel threatened by crypto that does other things, right? Ethereum is just another thing. It does something entirely different from my perspective than Bitcoin. So I am a bit of a monetary Bitcoin maximalist, but that doesn't mean that I'm not excited about what's happening in crypto and programmable money and tokenization and stablecoins. I find that interesting too. And I think you can have that maxi mindset in Bitcoin and still be open. And so I think that's what we'll see a lot of ETF investors do, have their Bitcoin and then their Ethereum, and really think about them as sort of two separate buckets.
I agree. In China, they say that the strongest of the bamboo is the one who bends. So I think having a flexible mindset allow you to be, I don't know, a little bit stronger. Like you said, I'm a Bitcoiner by heart. I store my wealth into Bitcoin, but I also see a crypto market.
I agree completely. And it broadens the pie, I think is the reality, right? It broadens the pie. It brings people into the crypto universe. And yeah, I think we do need to be open-minded. And I also agree, if people want to buy it, let them buy it, right? I may not love meme coins, but I understand why they exist. And there are people who want to access it. And I'd love for them to be able to access it safely, right? That's a great, good thing. So I'm open on those fronts.
There's going to be people, they will buy a meme coin and then maybe a few years later they'll be Bitcoiners because, they'll learn their lessons and they'll pay their tuition, as I say. How big do you think Trump is going to impact the market? He's surrounding himself with pro-crypto people. So do you think it's going to be a massive thing we will feel from basically day one?
Oh, I think we'll feel it from day one. If you've been, it's hard for someone who hasn't been operating inside the crypto ecosystem to understand how suffocating it has been from a regulatory perspective. It's not just the things you see from the outside, like working for 10 years to get a Bitcoin ETF, which is nearly a record in the ETF industry to offer something so simple that helps investors access what has been the best performing asset in the world over those 10 years. Like, that seems ridiculous. But beyond that, at every level, everything you did was an uphill battle. With Operation Choke Point 2.0, getting a bank account was an uphill battle, and you would periodically lose your bank account. If you were an entrepreneur with talent, thinking about where to build in the tech economy, would you really want to go into crypto where a senator has a anti-crypto army and the SEC, doesn't talk to you and then files suit against you if you try to do something? And then if you're trying to work with a traditional institution and you go to talk to them about this interesting new technology and they say, yeah, but Gary Gensler says it's all a scam and the White House won't let banks interact with this space at all. And the world, the IMF and others say that this is toxic and only used by criminals. That just shut down that conversation completely. So the market has been absolutely suffocated for 10 years from a regulatory perspective. And that's going to lift even beyond the specifics, like withdrawing SEC suits or reversing SAB 121 to allow custody or allowing more ETFs into the market. Lifting that oppressive regulatory regime will allow all the entrepreneurs to actually build things with this incredible technology. And I think people are undercounting by a factor of 10 what that means. It's going to be a renaissance for crypto, a sort of golden age. And I think you'll start to see it immediately. You're probably already starting to see it on the edges right now.
Like holding a ball underwater, and when you leave it, it's going to pop. Because I feel like all this pressure, like you said, is building and building up and building up. And at some point has to pop. Because like you said, they're going to lay down so many good things. And what do you think about stablecoin? Because I think soon-ish, maybe, we will see banks starting to play with USDC. Maybe it seems like in Europe with Mika, there's been some fad on Tether, which I think many people misunderstood what was going on. But Coinbase has the upper hand, maybe also because of the fact that they are the custodian for the majority of the ETFs. But it feels like if there is a stable coin who is kind of establishing itself a little bit more is USDC. So do you see maybe banks at some point in 2025 start saying you can convert your dollars or euros or pounds, or whatever it might be, into maybe USDC?
Yes, absolutely. I see that. They all want in on this massive, profit potential in the stablecoin space. We've mentioned before that there's some quarters where Tether makes more money than Goldman Sachs. US banks don't like that. They want to make that money for themselves. I think you'll see multiple banks launch stablecoins. I think by the end of this year, we could be paying for certain things with stablecoins on a regular basis. I think by next year, you might be paying for things on Amazon with stablecoins at a discount to their price if you use a traditional credit card. Sometimes I like to think about things in the world that don't make any sense. One thing in the world that doesn't make any sense is the take rate for credit cards on every transaction being north of 2%. And that is just so beyond absurd in today's day and age. I think that's going to be disrupted substantially. I think we could be at $1 trillion in stablecoins by the end of next year. I think people underestimate the impact of stablecoins in the US. And then when you go globally, it's that, but on steroids, right? They have, when you go outside of a country like the US with a relatively well-established financial system, you get all of those cost savings benefits, plus you get modern financial infrastructure and a currency that debases at a lower rate than local currencies. And the growth there can be exponential as well. So I really think it's one of the greatest advances in crypto. I think it's going to be massive. And I think it's going to hockey stick up almost immediately as the Trump administration takes over.
Like you said so well, we forget to see that there is people where they don't have access to banks, right? And all they have is a phone in their pockets, which is great because with a crypto wallet, you can transfer maybe Tether, USDC, or whatever stablecoin might be, basically in an instant for a fraction of a penny.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. And it's also a massive humanitarian benefit for the people of those countries who have had no other choice. That's the thing that people don't get about crypto, is it just offers a choice. They've been you think about somebody in a country with a poor currency that's been facing inflation throughout their lifetime, that's probably seen multiple devaluations, that pays high fees for any sort of financial transaction. And all of a sudden they have access to stable coins, which is the US dollar that moves frictionlessly around the world. It's a massive humanitarian benefit. I mean, it's just incredible for the world. And you can see it having real world impact. I mean, Stripe paid $1.1 billion for Bridge. It's a massive acquisition because stablecoins are so important to the future of commerce internationally. I always try not to be too bullish, but it's hard not to be too bullish on stablecoin growth. I really think it could be $1 trillion easily by the end of next year. And there's probably upside to that beyond that. It's an incredible killer app, an incredible gift for the world.
I could stay in here all night with you, but I promised, so I'll stick to my time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the channel. Guys, as always, in the description, you will find Matt details. Please go and follow his Twitter account. It's one of my absolute favorites. We are really lucky to have you in this space.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun. Yeah, let's check back in again soon, see how we're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And guys, thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one.